President Trump is now in South Korea for the third and final leg of his trip across Asia. Over the past few hours, the president met with his South Korean counterpart as the two countries work to finalize a trade deal. The president was granted a series of gifts while there, including a replica of an historic gold crown, as well as the country's highest medal, which was said to be awarded to him for his continued role as a, quote, peacemaker on the Korean peninsula. President Trump also addressed a group of leaders and CEOs also gathered in South Korea for this year's Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit. You'll hear us mention it as APEC.
Welcome to the News at 4. I'm Brenda Rodriguez.
And I'm Joe Paris.
As he completes the final leg of his trip to Asia, President Donald Trump says that he's worked out a deal with South Korea to lower tariffs on products from that country. And it comes a day before a highly anticipated meeting between the president and the Chinese president, which many expect will calm some trade tensions between the two countries.
The US has made a trade breakthrough with South Korea. That was the word from President Donald Trump on Wednesday. Trump said the two countries had reached a deal and had pretty much finalized it. His comments came at a dinner hosted by South Korean President Lee Jae-myung after a lavish welcome and gift-giving as Trump was awarded the country's highest decoration.
The world just witnessed a geopolitical earthquake. For decades, South Korea stood as one of America's most loyal allies, an anchor of democracy and stability in East Asia. But now, that foundation is shaking. President Donald Trump proudly announced what he called a historic $100 billion trade deal with Seoul.
Made our deal, we pretty much finalized a trade deal, and we discussed some other things having to do with national security. It's concluded a trade deal, very big one, very big trade deal, and I always say good for both countries. And we discussed some other things having to do with national security, etc.
A move he believed would cement U.S. dominance in the region and deliver a major victory for American workers. But behind the headlines, something far more dramatic is unfolding. South Korea, long seen as Washington's trusted partner, appears to be quietly pivoting toward Beijing. It began with Trump's triumphant declaration: a 15% tariff on Korean imports, a promise of $100 billion in purchases of U.S. goods, and talk of fairness returning to American trade. Cameras flashed, markets reacted, and Washington celebrated. But in Seoul, the mood was complicated. While the deal seemed to secure investment and cooperation, it also carried an undertone of pressure, an echo of Trump's long-standing America First doctrine. In South Korea, analysts began asking hard questions. Was this deal really a partnership, or was it coercion disguised as diplomacy? Inside government circles, officials quietly voiced unease. The tariffs, though lower than expected, still struck at the heart of South Korea's export-driven economy. Auto manufacturers, shipbuilders, and tech firms faced new uncertainties. And when Trump doubled down on his immigration crackdown, targeting Korean workers at a Hyundai plant in Georgia, the insult hit deep. It was no longer just about economics. It was about respect. Within days, 300 South Korean engineers and managers boarded flights back to Seoul after being forced out of their jobs. The images flooded South Korean media workers waving national flags, families cheering their return, commentators calling it a humiliation at the hands of an ally. For a country that has stood by the United States since the Korean War, the symbolism was profound, and quietly, the seeds of change were planted. When President Lee Jae-myung took office in Seoul, his administration inherited a strained relationship. Trump's tariffs and public statements had left many Koreans questioning whether Washington still saw them as equals or simply as tools in its trade wars. Lee's foreign policy team began exploring what they called strategic balance, a diplomatic term that, in reality, meant looking to China as an alternative power center. Beijing, sensing opportunity, wasted no time. Chinese diplomats opened new trade channels, offering Seoul stability, lower tariffs, and access to supply chains that Washington was now restricting. Leaked reports revealed that South Korean and Chinese officials held several private meetings. Their discussions went beyond commerce. They talked about creating financial safety nets to shield both nations from American tariffs. Beijing proposed deeper integration in electronics, rare earth materials, and battery technologies industries central to Korea's future. In other words, China was offering partnership, not punishment. For decades, Seoul's policy had been simple: align with America, benefit from its protection, and follow its lead. But Trump's unpredictable style changed that equation. His public criticisms, tariff threats, and calls for allies to pay up on defense funding left even close partners feeling cornered. In South Korea, younger generations began to see the United States not as a guardian, but as a risk. Polls showed that nearly half of South Koreans now believe their country should balance its alliances rather than rely entirely on Washington. Then came President Lee's shocking statement. In an interview, he said, "We are grateful to the United States for decades of partnership, but the era of unconditional dependence is over." Those words reverberated across Washington like an earthquake. Within hours, Trump fired back on Truth Social, accusing Seoul of betrayal and threatening to reconsider America's military commitments. But South Korea didn't flinch. In fact, it responded with calm confidence. Editorials in Korean newspapers argued that the U.S. had stopped listening to its allies. One commentator wrote, "America speaks in ultimatums. Friends deserve dialogue." That sentiment captured a broader feeling South Korea wasn't abandoning the U.S., but it was asserting its independence. While Washington fumed, Seoul's diplomatic machinery kept moving. Delegations quietly traveled to Beijing, participating in economic forums where deeper cooperation was discussed under the radar. Some even hinted at limited involvement in China's Belt and Road Initiative, a project Washington has long viewed as a threat to its global influence. For U.S. officials, this was a red line, but for Seoul, it was leverage. Behind closed doors, South Korean officials were pragmatic. They knew their nation's prosperity depended on global trade. With China accounting for over a quarter of Korea's exports, ignoring Beijing was not an option. And with America turning inward, threatening tariffs on friends and foes alike, Seoul was adapting to survive. A senior lawmaker summed it up. "If America taxes our products and China opens its markets, where do you think we'll go?" As tensions escalated, Trump announced another round of tariffs, this time targeting China directly. The world braced for impact, yet South Korea's silence was deafening. Instead of echoing Washington's stance, Seoul issued a mild statement expressing understanding of China's position. It wasn't open defiance, but it wasn't support either. That neutrality marked a turning point. For the first time in modern history, South Korea wasn't automatically siding with the United States. In Washington, alarm bells rang. Former U.S. Ambassador to Seoul, Mark Lippert, warned that Trump's transactional approach was eroding decades of trust. "Trump treats allies like clients," he said. "You can't build alliances on invoices." Think tanks in Washington released urgent reports calling for diplomacy and restraint. But inside the Trump administration, frustration prevailed. Congressional committees began discussing potential cuts to joint defense projects as a warning shot. Meanwhile, China moved swiftly to consolidate its gains. Beijing extended new credit lines to Korean industries, offered preferential trade terms, and invited Korean companies to participate in technology exchanges. State media framed it as a partnership of equals. To many in Seoul, it sounded appealing, especially compared to the unpredictable pressure coming from Washington. Public opinion mirrored this shift. University forums debated whether the American alliance still served Korea's long-term interests. Television anchors asked, "Is the U.S. still our protector, or just another superpower demanding loyalty?" For a nation that once saw American troops as its ultimate security guarantee, this was a stunning transformation. But it wasn't just emotion driving the change, it was cold economics. Trump's tariff structure hit Korean steel, auto parts, and electronics exports hard. U.S. companies began delaying joint projects due to cost uncertainty. In contrast, Chinese investments poured in, especially in semiconductor production and green energy. For South Korean leaders, the contrast was impossible to ignore. One side offered confrontation, the other offered cooperation. When Trump publicly accused Seoul of double dealing, South Korean officials chose not to respond directly. Instead, they continued negotiations with Beijing, this time discussing shared logistics routes and mutual defense of trade infrastructure. Reports surfaced that both sides were exploring participation in regional frameworks that excluded the United States entirely. And so, what began as a simple trade deal has turned into a moment of truth for America's global power. South Korea isn't declaring independence from the US, it's redefining it. The world is shifting, alliances are evolving, and even Washington's closest friends are starting to act on their own terms. The question now is, can America adjust before it's too late?